I started recording, so don't talk about your trade secrets anymore.
Don't talk shit anymore?
No, talk
Yeah.
shit, just not trade secrets. We can't talk about how Gold Eagle's starting their own label.
Man, that's been pushed off and pushed off far beyond how much I wanted it to be. I wanted it
Are you
to
going
be
to
out
call it
already.
Addison and Waverly?
No. Hell no. Eagles Reserve.
You saw what I was trying to do there, though, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
A podcast about bourbon and the ones who drink it. This is Bourbon Matters. Welcome to Bourbon Matters. I'm Jake.
I'm Dan.
And I am Gold Eagle Jake.
And tonight we are busting whiskey myths.
Myth? Can we say myth busted? Is that trademarked?
Mythbuster.
It can't be.
I don't know if it is or not.
Not.
I don't know either.
Just Mythbuster, but
we're doing it.
I don't know if we're gonna bust myths, but we're just gonna talk about.
I was going to say how we're going to tell if they're.
Okay. We're going to talk about them and our opinions and others' opinions on them.
All right.
So yeah, do we have anything anybody wants to talk about before we jump in?
No, I just got to my computer and you guys were talking about all this in the chat that I wasn't paying attention to. So
yeah, I feel like if Dan had some time to do some research, he would have come up with some interesting points. But how many different whiskey myths are there out there? I mean, there's a handful, but nothing like too intense.
Yeah.
I feel.
Well, let's start with the biggest one.
I know what you're gonna say.
Is the neck pour.
The neck pour.
So I think everybody has probably heard about the neck pour, or even themselves have complained about having a neck pour. If anybody doesn't know, this is supposedly the first pour out of a bottle that's freshly opened. And the myth is that the whiskey that sits in the neck of the bottle is somehow inferior to the whiskey in the rest of the bottle. So I found an article on Men's Health that was talking about this. And one of the author talked to a bunch of different people about neck pours from all different aspects of the whiskey and spirits industry. And one of the contributors was like, this can easily be disproven by just turning the bottle upside down and then opening it and pouring it. I don't know why this is even a thing, which is totally accurate. But if someone's insistent on the neck pour, it's actually the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Wilderness Trail that I think gave the best insight on this. His name is Pat Heist, and he's a PhD. So he talks about my thoughts from the standpoint of a chemist, whiskey enthusiast, and expert are that the first pour is more about the mood, the premeditated expectations, the physiological state, and what the taster had to eat recently. I think that really sums it up pretty well. I don't know about you guys.
So I agree, but I would like to add what I believe is the number one reason why this term even came to be. So I think the neck pour, so we all know when the whiskey gets into the bottle, nothing is going to change. It's not going to age any longer once it's in glass. But we all also know that once the whiskey sees some air, the whiskey can change a little bit. So I think this term kind of came about because, yes, what you had to eat and your mood plays a big role in what you're going to taste and how you feel about the whiskey. But also, once that bottle of whiskey gets some air, it can open up quite tremendously and change a little bit. So I think the neck pour is kind of a term just to describe that first, pour where the whiskey hasn't seen oxygen in quite some time.
See, when I hear people use it, it's when you open a bottle and start pouring. They're like, "Oh, I don't want that. That's the neck pour." And I'm like, "Don't be a bitch.
See,
just drink the
then
fucking
you're
whiskey."
stupid. I think you're stupid if
Like,
you,
I
if you
agree.
actually believe that.
I agree. The whole thing
And
of
some people probably do, but
yeah, I agree. Like it's always best to open up a bottle and let it sit for a minute or two. Pour it into a glass, let it sit for a minute or two. Let it get some oxygen. Let it interact with the atmosphere. Let it open up a little bit. But it's not like letting it sit for 20 minutes is going to be better than 2 minutes because it's not oxygenating the whiskey. It's just letting it breathe, letting it intermingle. But yeah, if you're the person where I'm at somewhere and I pour you some and you're like, that's the neck pour, I don't want it. First of all, I'm going to drink that glass anyways. I don't care. Second of all, I'm not going to pour you another one. I'm going to pour myself a second one because you're a bitch.
Yeah. Well, like what's funny is the amount of time that you're supposed to let the whiskey quote unquote breathe wildly varies. Like Dan just said, up to like 2 minutes. Then there's other people that recommend 20 to 30 minutes.
well,
Who pours a glass of whiskey and just sits and looks at it for 20 to 30 minutes?
Well,
Jeez.
granted, this guy's a bar owner, but Bill
But also
Thomas, who owns Jack Rose Dining Saloon in DC, said that he likes to tell patrons to let their whiskey breathe for 20 minutes, especially if it's a higher end whiskey.
Does he also tell them that while it's breathing for 20 minutes, you need to have 3 Wheatley vodkas and lemonade?
Yes. So he said order something else while you wait for that.
Yeah, so all he's doing is for fucking money.
All right, so first off, that is one of the most famous whiskey bars. Second off, that is bullshit to let it. That he tells everyone to let it sit there for 20 minutes. I think he might be onto something because the anticipation that builds when you order something expensive and you let it sit there in the glass for 20 minutes and you're thinking about it and you're smelling it and then you finally go to taste it. It's like, oh, I've been waiting for this for 20 minutes and this is everything I imagined. That is probably why he says that. But there are certain whiskeys where I have found there's no difference in taste after letting it sit and fresh popping the bottle. And there are other whiskeys that have a dramatic change in flavor when I go back to them the next day. And yes, that can also be what you've had to eat that day. But one that pops out in my head is our Town Branch Single Barrel. Before we put a bottle on the bar and before we did the master class with them, I made sure we poured a bottle that was open for a day or two because that is one that changes dramatically from the time it's opened between a couple hours of getting some air.
Yeah, so I think for me, the only one that I've ever come across where I really noticed a difference was the Knob Creek 18. We actually did an episode specifically on that one. I think I said on that episode that I had tried this a few days before we recorded and absolutely despised it. And actually thought about not doing the episode, even though we had already kind of given you guys samples and everything for it. But then we had the episode and I was wowed by that whiskey and continue to really enjoy it. So whether it was something I ate that day or what, I don't know, but that definitely benefited from some time away from it. Whether that was psychological or not, I have no idea.
I think it's a little bit of both. So we know psychological is a real factor with tasting whiskey and your opinion on it, but sometimes there can be other factors that can play a role as well.
Yeah.
You know how I know you're full of shit about that? Can I ask you guys both a question?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Either of you guys had sex before?
Sure.
Yes, Dan.
So let's say Jake, your wife,
Jake
and
has a
Jake, your
kid.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the paternity test. So if your wife or Jake, your fiance, walked in and said, "Hey, baby, ready to have sex?" You'd be like, "No, I need to wait 20 minutes for the anticipation to build up." No one's saying that shit ever. All right. Same thing with the whiskey.
I guess that's one way to put it, but
I think
Because you know what can happen in 20 minutes?
what's
A fly could fly in that really
But-
expensive bottle of whiskey.
Yeah,
you
but
know what
you
could
know
also
what,
help in 20 minutes? She could get a headache.
yeah, but here you go. If you walk into one of the most famous whiskey bars in the country, which Jack Rose is, and the owner tells you let that sit for 20 minutes, you're gonna appreciate it a lot more. You're probably gonna let it sit.
So I don't do many tours. I do like special tours, things at the distillery. And when we go to the tasting thing, the first thing I say is, if you're not a big whiskey drinker and you want to learn how some basics of tasting, I'll walk you through them. If you already know if you already drink whiskey or you don't want to listen to me, that's fine, because you drink whiskey the way you want to drink it, not the way someone else tells you to drink it. First rule about whiskey: drink it the way you want to drink it. I am not going into that bar and waiting 20 minutes.
Yeah, you don't have to. It's a suggestion. But I think the other
Dan always stirring
aspect,
the pot.
yeah. The other
Jake R,
aspect
I
of
almost
this-
lost Jake R there for a minute. He fell off camera. Apparently, Jake's wife's had a headache once or twice.
Oh boy, this is gonna be a fun episode.
Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble for real. So, the other aspect of this that I wanted to talk about is, like Jake said, that like anticipation, because I do think it can be both a positive and negative force. One of the things the author noted in this article is that a lot of times he hears the neck pour associated with expensive whiskeys that he's having with like his friends or other people around him. I think that's an interesting thing to think about, where if you have an expensive bottle like a Knob 18 or whatever,
That one is not good on the neck pour. That needs to breathe.
like you're
I'm just stirring the pot here.
Yeah, but like you got a Michter's 10 or Parker's Heritage, or something like really special that you've been saving, and like you're pumped to open it up one day and it's just like not as good as you think it's gonna be. That can kind of ruin it,
So I had the same conversation with a couple people about Stag, or what used to be Stag Junior, because it's now 0-3 in our blind tastings, and we were just trying to figure out why does it not hold up, and why do people go so crazy for it? And a lot of people say it's top of their list on bourbons to find. I kind of just find it to be hot, and there's just not a lot to it. And we came to the conclusion that it's really just a mental thing. When you see a bottle of Stag, it's, oh, Stag, this is going to be high proof. I know, but it's a very special pour. It's going to be very good. And then you sip it and you're like, oh yeah, that's everything I expected and wanted in a bourbon. But when you taste it blind, it's like, wow, that's just heat and not something that I want to drink all the time.
I've only had I've had a lot of Stag Junior. I've only had one Stag Senior.
Well, so I'm talking more the Junior, which is now technically
I was gonna say it'd be interesting
Stag.
to see it versus do a Senior in a blind like that, because when I had Stag Senior the one time, like I do remember that being more complex, having more flavor, and not just being hot.
Stag Senior is a whole nother ballpark than Stag. Stag Senior, I will never talk any shit on. I think it's one of the best bourbons I've ever tried. Sure, certain years are better than others, but it's consistently like 135 proof, and tastes like 110 proof and is just loaded with flavor with tons of complexity. But the junior, I've consistently found it just tastes hot.
Mhm.
And there's just not a lot of good flavors. And there's plenty of other whiskeys at that proof point that I would prefer.
Mm. Yes. Do you think that's like a label type of thing? Like people have the expectation for that label,
Yeah,
versus like a new release, like
mm-hmm.
something that like no one's ever really tasted before, has like a little bit less of like the built up expectation, you know?
Absolutely. Which to tie this conversation back to what we were talking about with the neck pour, it's the same thing. It's if you're going into that bottle on a fresh crack thinking, oh, I'm not going to like this as much as I will tomorrow because it is a neck pour, then sure, you won't like it as much.
Yeah.
And when you try it again, you're going to think it's better because you already put that pre-connotation in your mind that the neck pour is not going to be as good as the whiskey that's below the neck pour. Which again, I think the neck pour is just a term to kind of say it didn't get oxygen yet and it hasn't had a chance to open up. Obviously, there really is no such thing as the whiskey in the top tastes different than the whiskey in the bottom.
Yeah. I think one of the other interesting notes in the article is that like it's, even though it's not really the right idea, it's kind of good that people have this concept that like whiskey changes over time, whether it's in a glass or in the bottle or in the barrel, you know? So like overall it's kind of good. that this myth is kind of good for like whiskey. And like giving or like instilling in people that like whiskey changes, even though it's not quite on the mark.
Whiskey changes with oxygen.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
So like
Not in the bottle.
right. Yeah, it doesn't age. If the bottle's not open, it's not going to change. You can keep that bottle for 100 years. It's not going to change if as long as no oxygen got in there. You do find a lot of really, really old bottles that have leaked some air into there, and you can tell because they've evaporated a little bit. You can tell when you taste it because it just tastes oxidized. But yeah, like I'm sipping some Knob Creek right now that's down to the last, 1/10 of the bottle. If I let this sit for another 6 months, it's probably going to taste very airy, definitely going to lack flavor. So I usually try to finish bottles once I get to about a third and below.
Yeah, I'm drinking the Delbach
Delbach.
Dorado, and I absolutely love this whiskey. For those that don't know, it's instead of peated, it's mesquited. So they smoke the malted barley with mesquite smoke, that they burn on site. And this bottle's been open for quite some time, and it's lost a lot of that like smoky element. Though a lot of those like the like mesquite notes are still there. Like this used to be much more like a freshly opened peated scotch, where it kind of like slaps you in the face with some smoke and like barbecue. It's lost it a little bit over time. Which kind of rolls us into the next whiskey.
Oh, Dan, what do we got here?
Oh, Dan, you can talk about your thing.
Yeah, so this is about 2 years old. I've recently started attacking this one. A few weeks ago, it was about half full, and now it's, it's not level. A couple pours left in it, but like I don't know, I can't remember. Like I remembered when I first opened this too. That's a Woodford 118.4 proof. If you're not watching, when I first opened, it was phenomenal, and it's 2 years old, and it's still phenomenal.
Yeah, so that's the next big myth, is that whiskey goes bad after you open the bottle. I think this is a really interesting one because there's a lot of like let's call it lore around how much of a bottle has to be left before it starts going bad, in quotes, and how long you can actually let it sit before it starts going bad and things like that. I think usually the standard is like if you have less than half the bottle open for over 2 years, it's bad. Yeah, I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on that.
I wouldn't say it's bad. It's not like it's turned like sour milk. It probably doesn't taste as much as it did, or taste like it does when you started. But like I'm also not one that leaves a lot of bottles. When I see a bottle gets over halfway gone or close to halfway gone, that's my focus point because I'm trying to get something off the shelf to make room for something new.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't like to let sit stuff more than 2 years just because of that. But I don't. It doesn't have like an expiration date where it goes bad. Is it going to taste different than it probably did originally? Yes. But if you bought a good bottle of whiskey, it's still going to taste good like this. Like,
I'm guilty of letting a lot of bottles sit at less than half full for a while, and that's because pretty much all the bottles I really love and bring home are single barrels. So I know I'm never going to get that whiskey again. And so I let a lot of bottles sit and wait for no reason, like no good reason at all. Should just be drinking them. But it's not. There's no really right point on when you should finish the bottle or drink the bottle. It really just comes down to how much air is leaking into that bottle. If the cork is not super firm and fitting in that bottle, then you should probably drink that thing or find a new cork. Because air and oxygen is the only thing that's really going to make that thing go bad. Now, if it gets down to the Knob Creek that I showed, that's literally, it's less than Dan's. It's 10% left. I'm probably going to finish this bottle within the next 2 months. But it's not going to change overnight. It's not going to, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll finish it tonight.
That'd be my
talk on this podcast for. But... But I reach for certain things when I crave certain things, and that's another reason why I'm afraid to finish certain single barrels, because I know it's a single barrel and I'm never going to get that barrel again.
Yeah, like I am also guilty of leaving lots of things partially finished.
No, really?
Just because there's so much. But like I have not really found this to be like super accurate. I've definitely gone back and revisited things after a long time and found that I didn't like them as much, but I don't know if that's just my palate changing more than the whiskey changing drastically in some way.
Yeah, there's just too many factors at play.
Yeah. So like this is one where I understand the like chemistry aspect of the oxidizing of the liquid and stuff, and that you will get flavor change to some degree. I just don't know if it's always for the worse, the way that like the myth kind of makes it sound. Did you have to? I had to do that on my cork too.
Classic Knob Creek.
Actually, this is weird timing. I just had an alarm go off. It's been exactly 17,500 hours since I opened this, which is almost 2 years. It's gone bad. I can't drink anymore.
I thought you were about to come up with something a lot.
Just gonna pour it down the drain.
Than that.
Yeah.
I had an alarm go off at Whiskey Acres. I gotta leave right now. Somebody's breaking into our distillery.
Pouring it right down the drain, and there's a lot of it gone. I'll save a little left just to look at. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Any more thoughts on whiskey going bad?
I mean, I guess I'll just back that up by saying there was a point in time at Gold Eagle before we had the bar when we used to have just a collection of miscellaneous sample bottles that reps and distilleries would leave behind, and before the bar we would let people taste things if they were interested in buying it, and a lot of these bottles are 7-8 years old that are open. I've gone back to taste them, and just really not tasted good. But again, that was because they were just full of air. Most of them were less than a quarter left, and the corks weren't fully secure. So there's obviously a lot of factors that can play into this, what you ate and all that stuff. But I think mostly it has to do with how much oxygen has gotten into the bottle and touched the whiskey.
Yeah, I think like after 2 years, don't just dump stuff. Like,
Well, don't
Try
dump it. Don't ever dump it unless it's just tastes awful.
yeah,
God,
I
if I
like,
knew someone like that, I would not be friends with them anymore.
are you making fun of me?
No, would never. I would never.
I did recently dump a whole bunch of stuff, but that's
Yeah, and
because
if you're part of the Lake County Whiskey Club, feel free to bitch because Jake's like, what else would I do with it? I'm like, I don't know. Ask people in the Lake County Whiskey Club if they want some free whiskey. I bet some people would have took a lot of those bottles.
I just didn't want to have to deal with the logistics of offloading it.
Man, just make a big container of an old fashioned or something.
Don't you have a 35-gallon or 25-gallon barrel in your house now? You could have started making an infinity barrel.
I sealed it and stuff. It wouldn't work
How'd you seal it?
with polyurethane.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do that then.
All right. The other interesting myth that I found, this one's more like this one's a tad more philosophical. Water source has a significant impact on the end whiskey.
You
I
talking
don't think
about
that's a myth.
cutting down?
That's not a myth.
Are you talking about proofing down, or are you talking about the initial?
The initial
Who said that's a
water
myth?
used for fermentation,
That's what I wanna
and
know.
distillation.
That's completely true. That's a huge factor.
Water is huge for the
Yeah.
final taste on a whiskey.
Yeah, that's not even debatable.
At the
Jake, you should know
distillation
this.
end.
Yes.
Yes, you after water after it's been distilled, you want pure, clean water so you don't change the flavor. The water on the front end is very important.
I mean, you can taste the same thing.
Okay, I'm thinking of it
So-
backwards.
So this is a little different, but talking in beer terms, Dovetail Brewery, downtown Chicago, which we know whiskey is just basically distilled beer. They offer the same beer brewed with the same ingredients, the same recipe, everything, just with different water sources. And you can taste the same beer using different water, and there's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there is a massive difference. And for those of you on video, my cat wanted to join.
Oh,
What
more
up?
FaceTime.
But yeah, I think water is a huge impact on the final flavor of the whiskey. I mean, Dan, tell them about Whiskey Acres. Tell them you guys share the limestone aquifer.
Yeah, there's one big giant limestone aquifer that runs through the entire United States, and we're farther north than Kentucky, so we get better water.
Well, yeah, I knew that.
It's not the same aquifer, but there are different channels. But no, it's
It's still
I mean,
limestone filtered water.
limestone filtered. Yeah, there's like when we were getting set up, Dave Pickerel was worried because there's a lot of places around here that are not that way, and it is very heavy iron, which is horrible for fermentation.
Oh, okay.
And if we were on one of those, we would have had to basically go to like a RO, reverse osmosis, or DI water system for everything, which basically strips everything clean.
Yeah, right.
So you don't get a lot of the added flavors and the added minerals from the limestone. If you're like sandstone or siltstone, you run into a lot of that issue. But we're not. We don't have iron in the water with it being limestone filtered. So that's a big, big difference. Now, afterwards, any good distillery is going to use a water without any purities in it because we got all the flavor we wanted out of it through the distillation process. So you're using RO or DI water, deionized water on the back end to proof it down. And then there's different proofing methods of how slow you can proof or how slow you should be proofing something down. But usually on the back end, you don't want anything in your water because it's going to change the flavor of everything you just made.
Right. You want the most purified water you can possibly get. Yeah, that makes sense.
It's. I mean, think of it this way: it's the same reason that you shouldn't be drinking distilled water because you're not getting all the different minerals and stuff that you get out of normal water.
Yeah.
If you just drink distilled water, you're lacking your body of nutrients. Well, the same thing happens for yeast. So,
yeah. I mean, I'm not arguing with you because I agree, but I have heard from distilleries that the water doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's because they're on a shitty water source.
That's wrong.
Versus city water.
That's wrong.
That's a marketing ploy that they try to use. Like that's like when I do my stupid little tours. Not stupid little tours. When I do my tours,
when you do them, they're stupid.
when I do them, they're stupid little tours. But like that's like I'm like the one thing that Kentucky does right is they talk about how good their water source is. The one thing they try and make you believe though is that there's only one limestone aquifer in the United States and it's right under Kentucky. That's not true. That there's a bunch of them throughout the U.S. Cat Cam.
There he is.
But yeah, water is very important on the front end.
So what we call that one myth confirmed.
Whatever it is,
Water
where
does
people
matter.
say that water doesn't matter, they're a jackass. That's
I don't even know if that's
Or
a
it'd be
myth.
that myth is busted. Water
whoever said that
doesn't play an important role.
Is dumb confirmed.
Is dumb confirmed. That's our new slogan.
Whoever said that
Big
is
red
dumb,
stamp.
and that's
Boom.
confirmed. So I've got some like rapid fire little ones to touch on. If you don't have some,
that was my last big one. So
okay, so 99% of people listening to this podcast already know this, but it's alarming how many people walk into the store and think bourbon can only be made in Kentucky.
yeah,
That was
I wouldn't say 99%.
That was a 1964 law, regulation, whatever you want to call it, that the United States national spirit is bourbon, and it can be made anywhere in the U.S., and it does not have to be made in Kentucky. So
That's part of my
throw
tour,
it
too.
I'll throw it to you, Dan, to kind of talk about why people think bourbon needs to be made in Kentucky. I mean, it's crazy how many people walk in and they're like, "That's not bourbon. That's made in Illinois." Like, I want real bourbon.
Kentucky
marketing.
kind of perpetuates that myth.
Yeah, that's like people always say, like when we're at different pouring events and there's a bunch of different Illinois distilleries there, they're like, "Oh, you are always with your competition?" I'm like, our competition is Kentucky. It's breaking all the norms that Kentucky marketing has put into place, and it's it's the amount of people that come into the distillery. And one of the first things I do is we talk about corn. And we'll talk about how corn's in our bourbon, and someone will go, "That can't be bourbon. That's not in Kentucky." And then I'll ask anybody. Then at that point, usually when I transition, I go, "Well, what are the 4 rules that whiskey has to follow to be called bourbon?" I'll give you a hint. The first one is it doesn't have to be made in Kentucky, and if anyone else says that, you can get off my tour. Is usually where we go with that. No, it's just marketing. If you go there, they talk. Every distillery is in on it in Kentucky. They all talk that Kentucky's got the best bourbon in the world, and it's because of the water. Mm-hmm. Every distillery says that. They're all in agreement on how they present
the water and the climate.
Yeah, well,
which is very similar to what we have here.
Oh, and we have better corn. Oh, and we have the same water. Oh, weird. But don't we have 200 years of distilling experience? That's the one thing we're.
That's what they should be talking about.
Yeah,
these distilleries have been here for 100 years, and they're learning from their mistakes and making tweaks and making the bourbon better.
We like to say that we spend more time on our tour talking about corn than Kentucky does because all I can talk about is water, and we have their same water. So let's talk about something else. Is usually the way I phrase it.
And everyone wants to listen to you talk about corn sex. That's the greatest thing
in the
history of the world. Man. So
what's the F2? What's the F2?
Another
Jake?
one. So again, 99% of our listeners probably, well, I would hope that they'd know this. Maybe it's a little less, maybe 90%. But older means better.
If they listen to this podcast, they know it's not true.
Yeah.
You keep saying 99%. We get about 100 listens per episode. So are you just calling out Drew on every question here?
Drew knows better. Come on. But no, older is better. It's also alarming how many people come into the store and they're like, I want a 10-year-old or I want an 8-year-old, and then you or if they if they don't say that and you're like, here, try this bourbon, and they're like, how old is it? And I'm like, why does that matter? It tastes great. Or it's a 6-year, and they're like, oh, I don't like 6-year bourbon. Well, you haven't tried this bourbon yet, so why are you making up your mind about what you think about this bourbon? So why do people think older is better? And a lot of I have never tried Pappy 20 or 23. But a lot of people who have tried the whole lineup will tell you the 15 year is the best.
I like 12 better than 15. I've never tried the older ones, but I like 12, then 10.
I like 15 better than 12. I like
the reviews of the older
15,
ones.
10, then 12.
The older ones, the reviews of the older ones that I've read, both call them or call both of them challenging. That doesn't sound like what I want out of a whiskey.
Challenging, chewing on oak, chewing on wet wood,
earth and dirt and moss and like shit like that. It's like
and Jimmy Russell says their sweet spot for bourbon is 8 to 12 years. Anything older than that, he doesn't like.
But then they just put out a 15-year-old.
Well, they did, yeah. I mean, they're owned by Campari now, so Campari is in their ear telling them kind of what to do. But he's on record multiple times saying 8 to 12 years is the sweet spot. And by the way, I did try the 15-year, and I think their 13-year is much better.
I've heard that across the board.
It's so much better. It's so much more lively. It has that wild turkey funk and fruit that you love on wild turkey, and the 15-year just loses all of that fruit and liveliness and just is all oak. Mm-hmm. So I think he's absolutely correct with that statement. And I would also argue that certain single barrels of Russell's Reserve are better than the 13-year.
Yeah. I've heard that as well.
So why are there so many people still caught on the fact that older is better? Is it because with Scotch, typically that can be the case because it ages a lot slower and Scotch has been around for a lot longer, and people just assume
it's so much more important with Scotch. And like
right. Well, that is the barrel. You don't have you have a fresh barrel char with bourbon. You don't with Scotch. Like you're getting way more flavor quicker.
And the climate in Scotland sucks, so there's not as much draw in and out of the barrel. Yeah, there's a lot of factors for sure. But like I think a lot of like a better way to categorize age statement is that typically older is more complex. Older is different. Like I mean, it depends. But I'm like it's not that. Well, I mean, for sure the flavor profile shifts drastically from like 2 years to 6+. Like.
So yes,
we've talked before about how younger bourbon carries a lot more like fruity kind of notes, and then as it ages, it kind of drops those out in flavor of like the baking spice, the oak, the vanilla, and like the tannic kind of notes of the oak. It kind of just depends on what you like and what you're going to gravitate towards. Like
definitely depends on what you like.
I like a lot of woody notes. Like I like that. I like dark fruit. So I tend to gravitate towards older stuff, which is my own personal problem.
Wait, but it also depends on the distillery too and how their whiskey ages. Sure. Because you're a big Hard Truth fan, and Hard Truth is very young.
Yes, it is, and I think it's I mean, climate matters. Aging method matters. Like I like Texas whiskey, which is very young because it can't be older than like 4 years, or else it just turns to shit. Like there's a lot that's like this Delbach is only like 2 years old because it's in the middle of the desert aging. And if it ages longer than that, it evaporates completely out of the barrel. So,
So I think we can agree, and most of our listeners can agree that it's bait. You know, you got to taste the whiskey first. Age doesn't necessarily matter as much. It just depends on what you think of the taste.
Yeah.
A good benchmark, which isn't necessarily true with all distilleries, but Dixon Deadman once told me that bourbon specifically, not other whiskeys, just bourbon, once it hits 6 years, it kind of starts to turn a little bit, and then you really start noticing different characters. And that is when you really need to hone in on what you want to be bottled, because it can start changing in various directions once it hits 6 years. But anything younger than that, typically, you can tell that it's youthful.
Well, and like what my caveat to that would be that like that's specific probably to Kentucky, right? Like he's speaking about Kentucky sourced bourbon that he was dealing with.
He's mostly talking Kentucky, yeah.
So like it definitely drastically varies from location to location, and that's where you really need to try stuff and understand what your personal ideal flavor profile is. Because you might like a really young bourbon from Colorado because whatever the altitude is doing, adds some kind of flavor that you really like. Or you might like Texas whiskey because it's got that like super charred, super oaky kind of thing going on, or whatever, So like age is like a decent metric within a specific region, but it's not the end all be all of everything. Like don't cross compare whiskeys across the United States based on the same age. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I was thinking more about that this morning, because going back to the bourbon has to be made in Kentucky thing, that's going to be my new talking point when I meet someone in the store that's like, "Oh, it's not in Kentucky, it's not bourbon." I'm gonna ask them, like, what if the first region in Scotland were to say it has to be made in this region to be Scotch? We would lose out on so many different flavors of Scotch whiskey. And I think the same thing is going to happen with bourbon, where people realize that there's different flavors, there's different styles that come from the different climates of different parts of the U.S. And it's just going to make bourbon that much more interesting as we see more distilleries pop up with well-aged spirit.
You could just pick up any non-Kentucky bottle and point to it and say, "This says it's bourbon. The government approved this label."
Well, believe me,
because then you're going to get into a whole thing with the government, and then it's not.
No, I mean, there's been people where I've done that too, and they're like, "That's bullshit. I don't like that distillery is not. They're doing it wrong. Like, it has to be in Kentucky. That is what bourbon is. Like, yeah." So there's a whole nother argument that comes with that. So if you're going to be that close-minded and think that bourbon only has to be made from Kentucky, which I don't know why I'm getting like a little heated and a little into this right now, because 99% of our listeners know that bourbon just has to be made in the U.S. and they love bourbon outside of Kentucky. But yeah, just it's you can't get through to that person who is like, "I don't want that. That's not bourbon. Like, that's false advertising because it's made in Illinois." You've always
got some delicious American whiskey for them to try as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So moving on from that, another one that I have, which again, all of our listeners know this, and I'm going to follow. So you need to spend a lot to get a good bottle of bourbon. Obviously, that's not true.
1,000% true.
It can be more true with Scotch, just because it's a little more mellow aged. But definitely not true with bourbon. There's tons of $20 bottles on the shelf. And just today I had somebody come in and ask for Blanton's, and I recommended the benchmark line with the single barrel and the full proof and the top floor and the different options
Which
there.
is basically the same thing.
And I told him basically the same thing. And you know what he said to me? And this was a relief on my end, but he was like, thank you for pointing this out, because most stores I go into try to show me a $200 bottle, $250 bottle and say this is going to taste just as good as Blanton's. And he was just like, thank you for showing me something that's affordable that I can just blindly buy a bottle and go home and try. But yeah, you don't need to spend a lot. Bourbon is not that expensive to make. Corn is not that expensive.
I thought Dan was joking, but Dan is adamant that
gotta be at least
matters.
$500 for me to want to drink it.
Oh, so now you're full of shit.
Yeah,
bourbon's only good if it's over $500.
But
I'm checking out that bottle of Millennium Weller on your app right now that I'm going to pick up.
Yeah, you want to pull the trigger?
Yep.
So I can tell you right now, there's not a bottle in your house that's over $200.
That's incorrect.
Yeah, Dan's like the anti spend a lot of money on a bottle.
What bottle is over $200 that's in your house right now? Which one?
That's not bourbon.
Bourbon. Okay, yeah.
Bourbon. Because there are other spirits that I do think are worth the price, and I'm not saying expensive bourbon isn't worth the price, but there's just so much bourbon available under $100 that tastes phenomenal that there's no reason to splurge and pay secondary or absurd MSRP prices on bourbon.
Yeah, I think actually the most expensive retail bottle I have is $180.
For what?
Michter's 10 Rye.
Oh. That's retail? No, it's not.
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. It's gone up a lot.
Yikes.
It's gone up a lot in the last 2 years. I think 2-3 years ago it was like 110.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I thought. I got mine for like 120.
No, it's gone up a lot.
Jeez,
yeah,
that's crazy.
But also the most expensive bottle I have at retail.
Yeah. I mean, Jake, you've got a lot of bottles.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
So I have expensive bottles and I have really cheap bottles. Like I'm staring at a Rittenhouse Rye right to my right, while I have Parker's Heritage and a fairly expensive Heaven Hill single barrel up there. I've found that a lot of the times it's just not worth the money in general for really expensive bourbon. When there's a lot of really good stuff that's well under $100.
And
sometimes like it's okay to like go experiment with something that's a little outside, but like I mean most of the stuff that's like surrounding me everything that's surrounding me right now is somewhere under $100, except the Bardstown stuff. But let's not talk about that.
I was gonna say let's be clear. We're not saying bourbon is not worth splurging on, and once in a while that nice bottle, that expensive bottle. Not all expensive bottles aren't worth it. You don't need to have an expensive collection.
Yeah, all of my favorites. You can have a
few bottles that you really like that are more expensive, but there's just a lot of really good bottles available at that $50 to $70 and just in general under $100 range.
Yeah, like all my favorites are like $60 to $80, which is still kind of pricey.
I'd say most
bourbon,
are 40 to 60, but
I mean, sub $100, like you're not really gonna go wrong. I even say sub 60, you can still find like incredible whiskey. It's just you got to know what you want.
Yeah, you got to know what you want. You got to taste. You got to explore your palate. And to kind of add on to that question, I don't want to talk about this too much because we always talk about it, and again, 99% of our listeners know this, but because it's allocated, it tastes better.
Yep.
It's the same thing as
As long
because
as
it's
it comes in a
expensive,
tube.
it
Only
tastes
if
better.
it comes in a tube.
There's so today alone, I mean, this is like one of the biggest headbanging things about my job, but today alone, I had 2 people ask me, "Do you guys have any allocated bourbon?" And my response now is yes, there is tons of allocated bourbon on the shelf right now. If you want, go grab a shopping cart and I'll point it all out to you.
Yeah.
And then they just look at me with a blank stare and they're just like, well, no, I'm looking for like Taylor and
No, one of
Weller.
Blanton's.
Yeah, Blanton's. And it's like, well, you said allocated bourbon. So there's Larceny Barrel Proof on the shelf. There's 1792 Full Proof on the shelf. There's tons and tons of things that are technically allocated on the shelf. So don't stop asking for allocated bourbon. Ask for what you want. If you want Taylor, ask for Taylor, and I'll tell you, go buy that Wild Turkey 101, blind it against Taylor at your house, and I guarantee you like that Wild Turkey better.
I told you how you need to handle these people.
Dude, it's the only part of my job that is just gives me headaches.
You have them blind it in the store. If they pick it, they can buy it. If not, then they got to buy whatever you blinded it against.
But they taste so similar. I'm not saying Colonel Taylor small batch is bad, but if you put it next to Wild Turkey 101, they just taste so similar.
Right. So then what if they really like Wild Turkey 101? They never come in there and ask for a Taylor again.
So it'd be more of like, here, I'm going to give you 2 whiskeys to try. You try both of these. You tell me what you like. And I bet you they'll taste them. They'll be like, ooh, I don't know. They're both good. Nothing really
Here's
stands
one that's
out
on the shelf every day.
Yeah.
And I should be paying you to get rid of it.
Less than half the price. And it's less than half the price. Yeah. So, yeah, again, our listeners don't need to hear this. They already know this, but it's just one of the biggest myths in bourbon is that because it's allocated or hard to find, it tastes better. And it goes back to the Stag Junior thing where people, their brains are just wired to believe that this pour is going to be amazing because it's from a bottle that's hard to find. And when they taste it, they think it's great. They think it's full of flavor. And if you taste it blind, it's hot, and there's no flavor.
It's an expectation thing.
It's for sure an expectation thing,
and a hype thing. I think we've talked about hype before. Sometime I think last year we talked about hype, overhyped whiskeys and stuff, and like anything allocated just gets so hyped up that
anything Buffalo Trace allocated.
There's people that are having like fever dreams about getting like a bottle of Taylor, and it's like, dude, like, trust us. Like, you can go drink other things that are just as good or better.
For the record, we're not saying the stuff is bad. It's just there's other things that are just as good that you can buy for cheaper that you don't have to worry about chasing down or hunting down. So
you don't need to visit 20 stores in a day to try and track down one bottle of whatever,
So again, I said I didn't want to talk about this too much because it could be a whole nother episode. So we're going to cut it off right there. So 2 more small things. One, not really a debate, but full proof means barrel proof. I hear that a lot.
Not the same.
There's a big misconception there. It's all marketing. Foolproof pretty much means
basically doesn't mean anything. It's just whatever they decide to bottle the whiskey at.
Right. And which most of the times is like the proof it enters into the barrel. But technically it's a marketing term. They can just decide to call it foolproof, and that's what it is. 1792 and Weller Full Proof are great examples because they call their highest proof full proof. But if you're bottling bourbon at barrel strength, you're not going to get the same proof every time. So full proof is not barrel strength. Dan, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Nope.
again, just quick touch points. And my last touch point of the night has nothing to do with whiskey. Just a common myth that also makes me bang my head in the store constantly. Beer. So the amount of times I hear people say, "Do you have any Coors Light that's not cold? I'm going to be bringing it to my house and I don't have room in my fridge and I don't want it to go bad before I move it to the fridge."
Oh, yeah.
Beer has no effect if it changes temperature. A lot of people think if the beer is cold and then it goes to warm and then it goes to cold, it's not going to taste good and it's going to taste skunky. All beer is pasteurized now. All beer comes into the stores in the summertime warm because it's on non-refrigerated trucks, and it all comes into the stores in the wintertime cold because it's cold outside and they're not temperature controlled trucks, and it goes to the floor or it goes into the fridge.
I thought some of them actually use refrigerated trucks.
They don't, not
They
anymore.
don't?
That's
Okay.
The shipping
That's-
cost is crazy.
That's an old myth. So 30 years ago, before they pasteurized beer, it did make a difference if it changes temperatures. And there's still people who are so stern on this that they will walk out of the liquor store because we don't have the beer that they want warm because it's only cold. They don't want to buy it and put it in their car and then bring it home and then have to put it in the fridge because they think it's going to go skunky. It's all pasteurized. There's no effect. The only time a beer really can go bad is if it's 100-degree day and it sits in your car for hours before you bring it home.
But all that
If
that's bad
Or
for
if it's
all.
passes
bad.
drink by date.
Yeah,
That's bad
that
for
too.
all
So-
types of drink, though. If it's in your
Yeah,
car on 100-some-degree
that's-
day for hours,
yeah.
That's another one that just makes me bang my head because it's unbelievable how many people will just walk out and not buy a 12-pack of Coors Light because they're like, you only have it cold and I'm not going to be able to get it home to my fridge within the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, I believe that one.
Oh, dude,
So I'm glad you put
it's
that
a,
to rest.
it's a very big misconception.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been told that my whole adult life that if you drink a beer and it's like, oh, this is kind of shitty. It's like, oh, well, it went from temperature swings and blah blah blah. And like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Just-
sure, if it's
just take
old
it.
and it's been in and out of like coolers and fridges and
Yeah,
cars
if it's
for
months and months
months
old,
and months
yeah.
and months, then yeah, it's not going to taste as good. And yeah, beer is best to be drank fresh. So after 3 to 6 months anyway, it's not going to taste as good if it's if it's not a stout, if it's like a fresh ale. You want to drink that fresh anyway. So
Yeah.
it's just more of the time but yeah, I just had to say that and clear that up because every day I get someone who is upset that we only have a certain beer cold and we don't have it warm. And it's like, well, it all comes in cold in the wintertime. It all comes in hot in the summertime. Where do you think we put it? It doesn't matter. It just goes either on the floor or in the cooler.
Does that include all the craft breweries too?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
There you go, folks.
There's a couple craft breweries that do actually refrigerate their trucks, but I mean, this is probably less than 5%.
Mhm.
Just a couple self-distroed ones, but either way, you can't expect the store to keep it cold if it came in cold and keep it warm if it came in warm. Like
Right.
it's going to go where it's going to go.
Right. Yeah.
And because all beer is pasteurized now, it really doesn't make a difference if it changes temperature. What matters is how fresh you drink it.
Yes. For those that don't know, can you explain what pasteurization really is?
I think we need someone else for that explanation.
No.
But
All right, I'll do it. I was just teeing it up for you because you're the expert on.
well, I mean, I always think of the Goose Island thing, right? After, when 2015, when the Bourbon County Stout got, it all went bad. It's because they didn't pasteurize it. So, like, it kept aging in the bottle at that point. And then after that, they decided to pasteurize it. So once it was bottled, it's not going to change at all. It's not really
Yes.
going to age. But yeah, we need a scientist or a chemist, and that's not me.
My understanding is that they bottle it, and then it basically gets like superheated, and it kills any bacteria inside the bottle.
Mm-hmm.
And
so
then
it's just like
good
milk.
for
Pretty much all milk is pasteurized. Most states actually outlaw raw milk.
Yeah.
That's such a new dumb thing too, by the way.
There's Farmer Dan to give his input on.
On that note, Jake, if people want to come in and see you on your soapbox and buy cold and warm beer or whiskey, where can they go?
They can come to 255 Peterson Road in Libertyville, Illinois. But they can also go to goldeaglewine.com, and they can also follow us on Facebook at Facebook Gold Eagle Spirits, Instagram Gold Eagle Wine. See everything we have new, and we are uploading a couple new tastings this weekend, so definitely keep an eye on the tastings. But yeah, keep up to date. Instagram, Facebook, website. We appreciate all the support. Throwing it back to Bourbon Matters.
Yeah, if you want to listen to Bourbon Matters, in case you're somehow listening to this and don't know how you found it, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or Google Podcasts, or anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. You can watch us on Spotify and YouTube. Make sure you like, subscribe, rate us, share with your friends. Also, check out Movie Matters. Me and my buddy Kevin talk about movies. Every Monday we drop an episode. So follow us on Instagram at Movie Matters Podcast as well. Share that with your friends. My dogs are not here. For those that are just listening, there's cats and dogs on the screen. I lock mine out of the room because they're out of their minds.
Don't mind my messy room, but look at this cat.
Look at the little puppy who's 10 years old.
Oh, Yuki.
Ukester.
All right. See you next week. Cheers, boys.
Cheers.
Nobody has a good glass to clink with?
No.
Thank you.